Hello, everyone, and welcome to this month's edition of the Global Outlook. I'm Alex Holmes, and I head up our team of brilliant analysts covering the Asia-Pacific region. And joining me today is Sumedha Dasgupta. She's a senior analyst who leads our coverage of South Asia. Now, Asia has had a lot of elections this year. In fact, the most people have voted in history. And for the most part, they went broadly as expected until, well, then they didn't. And it was the region's largest plebiscite in India where we got somewhat of a surprise. So Modi was sworn in for a third term as we had expected, but contrary to expectations, he did so with a much diminished majority. So Sumedha, in the reform mix that India and Modi have been pursuing, which ones do you think now will be very difficult to address due to a thin parliamentary majority?
Well, as you mentioned, Alex, of course, the BJP-led coalition now commands a significantly lower majority in the lower house of parliament. At the same time, they also narrowly lack a majority in the upper house. So we gauge that this will certainly affect their ability to carry out reforms in select areas through the parliamentary channel. Large-scale business-oriented reforms related to easing land acquisition, uniform adoption of labor laws across states, asset monetization, privatization, these are the ones which will face legislative obstructions. For instance, we now do not expect the government to introduce legislation aimed at easing land acquisition for businesses at all due to opposition from multiple stakeholders, including, for example, farmers, who are an important vote bank.
Great. And anything that you think hasn't been affected that will go on kind of as normal?
So we do believe that areas which largely operate beyond the remit of parliament will be the ones which will be unimpeded by the low majority. So these will include things like developing defense capabilities, promoting the adoption of technology, digitization, formulating renewable energy policies, provision of subsidized loans to small industries, sealing bilateral trade agreements, all of them will continue. Fiscal constraints do mean that infrastructure spending will possibly gradually moderate over the years, but still remain an area of focus. The nascent chip industry in India is something that the government will continue to try to develop, especially the state support for legacy chip manufacturing through subsidies, tie-ups with foreign players will continue. Green initiatives will, of course, be toned down, but still supported through things like the hydrogen mission or the EV charging grid. Technological upgrades also will continue. And the flagship initiative to strengthen India's manufacturing sector will certainly be a focus through industrial policy. The government's production-linked incentive schemes, which are operational in several sectors of the economy, will be refined, expanded, larger outlays will be provided. For example, the scheme has been doing well in areas like telecommunication equipment, white goods, food processing, electronics, among others.
Thanks. And you mentioned manufacturing. Obviously, India is one of the countries competing to pick up some of the pieces of diversifying global supply chains. But how do you think it now stacks up against competitors such as Southeast Asia post the election?
Well, we've always believed that India is increasingly well placed to capitalize on trends of diversification and supply chains because of intrinsic capabilities such as its strong economic fundamentals, a sound digital infrastructure, favorable demographics, market opportunities. But India, of course, will continue to face intense competition in attracting investment, especially because many Southeast Asian nations, which are pursuing similar strategies to appeal to investors, have far more advanced offerings than India has at this point in time, which basically means that the BJP's unanticipated narrow margin of victory will have a negative effect on business confidence, and policy gridlocks on large-scale reforms, as I mentioned, will of course mean that India's aim to compete with Southeast Asian countries for China Plus One investment does face a moderate setback. There are a few important factors, however, which we feel still weigh in India's favor. For example, its youthful demographic profile, less onerous wage regulations, steadily improving infrastructure, trade agreements, all these will gradually improve the business environment. And finally, of course, the size and potential of India's domestic market means that manufacturers are likely to overlook aspects of India's business environment, which may prove to be challenging, especially because Southeast Asian nations will hit their demographic barriers early in the next decade. And in the medium term, we do know that India is the only single country market which will provide a potential scale comparable to, say, China.
Yeah, and then moving on now to like a slightly different topic. What's your idea about the social and political stability outlook and India's foreign policy post the election?
We believe that political instability now does emerge as a significant risk in India after a decade of no concern on this front whatsoever. But we also feel that the BJP-led coalition will certainly successfully complete its term, which ends in 2029, owing to generally a strong relationship with its allies, as well as certain underlying synergies and policy direction. Also, the strengthening of the opposition's alliance parliamentary majority after a decade of BJP rule means that there is certainly a very healthy democratic process continuing in India, which will in turn keep the government and opposition very wary of complacency, which is a good thing. And the government's narrow majority also means it will not be possible for the BJP to amend the constitution to introduce certain contentious social reforms, which in turn means that it's very positive for social stability because it deflects potential social tensions and religious skirmishes that could have resulted from these undertakings. On the area of foreign policy, we do believe that the direction will remain broadly unchanged from the past decade, and India will continue to forge closer ties with the West and its allies, gradually unravel its arms dependence on Russia. Friction with China is, of course, expected to continue in both political and business areas. But we do feel that owing to domestic distractions on policymaking, the Prime Minister, Mr. Modi, is possibly likely to be less focused on pursuing a very aggressive international agenda as he had done in the past decade.
Great, really interesting. So if you were to talk about now the upshot for the economy, will India continue to be one of the fastest growing economies in the world over the coming years?
Well, there's certainly no denying that India's medium-term growth potential will now be somewhat lower than what we had forecast earlier, especially due to impasses on key reforms which we now expect. Even as the economy grows, there are also other challenges. For example, a large proportion of the workforce may not find employment in productive formal sector jobs. Another area of stress catching up is slow adaptation to climate change. The country's progress, as we see it, is basically premised on a shift up in the value chain that will happen in areas like information technology, manufacturing, business services, as well as other sectors. Of course, there will be a shift of the workforce out of rural labor into more productive urban jobs, improving productivity. Growth multiplier effects of earlier and ongoing infrastructure will also provide strength, as will greater capital intensity, technological adoption, these kind of things. So in general, we do believe that despite a more moderate growth trajectory after this election, India will maintain its general status as one of the strongest growing emerging markets.
Great. So it sounds like there's still a positive story for India. So thanks, Sumedha, for those insights, and thanks to anyone watching for doing so. Please do tune in again for next month's EIU Global Outlook.